So we've spent quite some time now delving into what we mean by religion. So when we started way back in lecture one, David said, okay, we think we have a rough idea of what religion is, and we think we have a rough idea of what science is. And the typical conversation is to say, how do the two interact? And then we spent some significant amount of time saying, okay, what does religion actually look like? What's religion really like? And now we seem to have maybe hopefully gone some way in that direction of getting a handle on it. So now it's time to look at what science is like. Now, hopefully we might imagine this is going to be easier because, there's lots of religions in the world. You've got, this religion and that religion, maybe this is a religion and maybe not. Whereas science, we've just got science. We don't talk about sciences in the way we talk about religions. We just have science. And we know what science is. You can write it down, right? You've got a scientific method which we can write down. It's nice and explicit. None of this esoteric weird stuff, right? We can write down what science is. We know what science is, and we're good to go. So here's the bad news I'm going to start off with. If that were the case, this lecture will be a lot shorter. In fact, this entire course will be a lot shorter. So we're going to have a look at what happens. Now, before I dive into what science is, I'm going to have to give a couple of caveats. So anything in science and religion discourse is controversial, with the possible exception of that statement, that everything else is controversial. So before I start talking about science, I'm going to have to say, okay, there exist some caveats. The position that I'm going to put forward is not universally held. Any position I put forward, there's going to be someone who stands up and goes, no, I don't think that. So rather than just preface every second sentence with, unless there are some people who think otherwise, okay, I'm going to cast a particular vision of science, which might be called something like the Enlightenment vision of science. This was the hope for science. This was the dream for science. When people were putting science together, in this golden age of we can change the world, of the Enlightenment, this is what they dreamt of. This is their hope. Now, their hope is not without its difficulties, and we're going to get to that in due course. But for this lecture, I'm just going to present this was the dream. This was the vision. This was what they thought they were doing. And I'm going to present it unapologetically. Now, you might, as I go through it, say, no, there's a problem there. Good. If you spot that problem, we can discuss it in class later. If you look through and go, no, that totally makes sense, fine. Then future lectures are going to be all the more exciting for you. So if you spot problems as I go through, just make a note of them and we can discuss them. That's fine. Now, I also have to say that some people genuinely hold this view of science that I'm about to present. And some people hold it pretty uncritically. Some people think they hold it in theory, but when you actually look at the science they're doing in practice, they're doing something completely different. Some people are aware that the science they're doing is not the same as the science they think they ought to be doing. And some people are totally oblivious to this difference. Some people think that this vision, even when they say, I'm not actually doing it, this vision is still the ideal. This is what I should be doing. And the further anything gets from this ideal, the further it gets from being proper, hard, pure science. Some people say, well, okay, this is what science is like most of the time, and occasionally it deviates from that. Some people say this is what science is like in most places, and just every now and then you get something that's a bit weird and kooky. And some people say that this entire vision of science is utter and complete balderdash, occasionally being promoted to bunkum. And that science is not like this, cannot be like this, never was like this, and never will be or should be like this. And that proper scientific literacy requires that we understand just how utterly wide of the mark this particular vision of science is. I'm sure you'll work out over the next couple of weeks where David and I stand on this particular point, but for this lecture, I am going to present an Enlightenment vision, hope of science. And even though there are people who disagree with it and so on and so forth. It's worth looking at anyway because it provides us with an understanding of how we got to where we are. It provides the context for why science and religion discussions seem to be so thorny. And it allows us to understand why people take particular positions which we might strongly disagree with, even though they're not crazy. Like, you can have people like Richard Dawkins, who is not crazy. He's taking a particular stance and he is working it through to its logical conclusion. And when we understand what that stance is, where he's coming from and why he's taking that stance, you can say, okay, I don't agree with him, but I at least understand why he's saying what he does. And then once you understand it, then you can come and say, okay, now let's see if we can discourse with each other more fruitfully than saying, I think you're crazy. So that's the aim of today's lecture, to work out where the framework is for how some people view science and how some people think science should be like. So science has got to have something to do with truth, right? If science isn't aiming for truth, I mean, we're what are we doing? Why do we get up in the morning? Okay, it's certainly looking for truth. Arguably, it finds truth. And the great thing about when science finds truth is you get to find truth with certainty. You know it because science, right? This is what science says. I should, take these vitamins, or I should get on this plane, or I should press this button, or do whatever, because science says. So we get to find the truth and we get to know the truth with certainty. And the great thing about scientific truth is universal. Okay, it doesn't depend on who you are. It's true for all people, right? We don't have to worry about like African science and Asian science and American science, because it's true for all people. It's true in all places. It's true at all times, right? We look at F equals ma, and Newton could say it, and we could say it, and we can say it again. Someone else can say it again in 200 years' time, right? It's true at all times, in all places. It's true if you happen to believe in right-wing politics and you want low taxes and small government, right? Energy is conserved. If you happen to go for big government and social justice, energy is conserved. If you happen to be a poor peasant farmer that's never heard of conservation of energy, that doesn't change the fact that energy is conserved. And if you happen to be an astronaut way in the future who's flying off to another galaxy, energy is conserved, right? It's always true for all people at all times in all places. And it holds for all questions. If science didn't hold for all questions, it wouldn't be universal, right? If there's any question that science doesn't give the answer to, then it's probably not a good question. Now, the great joy of this is science then gets to be coherent. I mean, you can't have one person in Africa saying this is the truth and one person in America saying this is the truth, and them having two different truths. Because if it holds for all people at all times in all places, it must be coherent. There's no other way that scientific truth can be. And similarly, it has to be consistent. So we have this wonderful vision. Now, this is good because this gets us towards world peace. Right? If you look at European history, right, Europe has been riven by religious wars, and one person says this land is mine and another person says this land is mine, or one person says you should read this book and another person says you should read this book. Now, if only we could find some universal way of seeking and finding the truth with certainty that all people could recognize, then we wouldn't need to go to war, right? We'd just pull out the science and we'd say, this is the answer, and all reasonable men can agree on it. And I say all reasonable men because welcome to Enlightenment Europe. Everyone that counts is a reasonable man. There are no unreasonable people, and there are no people that count that aren't men. So here we go. We can agree on it. It's all good. And then we don't have to have war. We have world peace. Who would fight against this? And now you can see here, this clearly puts religion in its place, right? If religion is universal, right? There's nothing within science let me back up that sentence again. If science is universal, right, there is nothing that science doesn't touch. There is no little corner in which religion can hide. If you can't have a non-overlapping magisteria because science takes the entire magisterium of everything that you can meaningfully say. So religion either has to say non-meaningful things, or religion has to say the same things as science is saying, because science says everything that's meaningfully, truthfully worth saying. So we either have religion just completely agrees with science, in which case, why do you need to bother going and being religious? Because you just go and do science because science tells you what the answer is. Or religion disagrees with science and then religion is wrong. So here we can see this is where the conflict hypothesis comes in. With this view of science, we either have religion is subsumed under science, or religion is against science, because as soon as religion says anything that isn't what science has already been saying, then we have conflict. Now, given that science is true for all people, science has to be objective, right? You can't have, well, this is what I think, this is my subjective feeling of what I think it should be like, this is how I feel it is, right? If science is true for all people, science is objective. It doesn't matter about your opinions. I've mentioned politics before. If it's true for all people, anything that sets one person apart from another cannot have anything to do with science. If not all people share the same political views, then those political views can have nothing to do with science. Otherwise, science wouldn't be true for all people. It has nothing to do with your character. If not everyone has the same character, if some people are virtuous and some people are not, then if science is true for all people, science has to be true for virtuous people and non-virtuous people. 2 + 2 = 4, whether you pay your taxes or not. 2 + 2 = 4, whether you are kind and loving and helpful, or whether you are mean and miserly and just generally unpleasant, right? Science must be independent of your character. Otherwise, it's not true for all people, okay? And it has to be independent of your religion, because not everyone has the same religion. If your scientific truth depends on which God you worship, and not everyone worships the same God as you, then your scientific truth is not true for all people. And if it's not true for all people, then it's not universal, which means it can't be true, which means it's not anything that science is doing, so we can utterly reject it. Now, again, here we see, okay, this view of science clearly sets out religion's place, namely religion has no place. If your religious perspective happens to, you know, if your religious perspective makes a difference to anything you say, if a Muslim and a Christian have different ideas on the topic, then it's dependent on your religion, and so forth. It has nothing to do with science. But if your religion doesn't change what you say, if Muslims and Christians agree on a particular point, well, then there's no point in bringing your religion into play, because the answer doesn't depend on your religion. Your religion is irrelevant. So we can see religion fits in this picture in a very well-placed box. Now, because it's subjective, it's also demonstrable. You can show your working, right? Scientists can't say, I have this feeling, the Lord told me, and he's not telling you, so, well, I know it, you have to listen to me, right? Science has to be demonstrable. You have to be able to say this reasonable, logical step, because then all people can see it, right? It has to be traceable. And it has to be rational. You can't say, I feel that this is the answer, right? You can't demonstrate your feelings, right? No one can look inside your heart, apart from maybe God, but no people can look inside your heart and see what you're feeling. You have to be able to externalize it. You have to be able to put it into words, rationally, demonstrably explain it, okay? Now, there is the objectivity condition here gives us a little bit of wiggle room for religion. Now, the universality thing, I said, okay, you can only have conflict, or you just subsume religion under science. originally I said, okay, you can't have non-overlapping magisteria because universality says there is only one magisterium. But the objectivity condition for science, it gives us a little bit of wiggle room where we can tuck religion in somewhere. And this is how it works. Okay, well, let's say if science has a universal claim over all objective truth, and if there is such a thing as subjective truth, then we have this sort of shadow world, this second layer where we've got the objective truth up here, and this is what science cares about. But then in this shadow layer underneath, we have subjective truth. Now, your subjective truth can depend upon your opinions and your character and your religion, right? If I feel that God is talking to me, well, that's my truth. And if you feel that there is no God, well, that's your truth, and this is subjective. Now, arguably, it's not demonstrable. I can't show that God is talking to me, but that's okay. That's all part of subjectivity, and this is part of religion. So as long as religion isn't claiming that you can demonstrate rationally what it's talking about, then it's all in this subjective layer. It's not encroaching on objective truth. So everything we said previously about this universal layer up here that religion is excluded from, we then say, okay, we've not thrown out religion. We've just thrown out religion from this layer. So now we can have religion existing on this shadow subjective layer that sits behind. And then, because it's subjective, religion doesn't have to be true for all people, right? So I have my religion and you have your religion and someone else has their irreligion. And that's okay, because we're not arguing about facts here. We're not arguing about that which is demonstrable. We're arguing about how we personally feel based on our opinions. And this then means that rather than having religious truth being universal, religious truth is particular. So we wouldn't, a Muslim thinks this and a Jew thinks that and a Baha'i thinks this, and we wouldn't expect their views to be coherent. We wouldn't require them to be consistent. That's okay, because they're operating on this plane. And science can't object that their views are inconsistent because, well, science is operating up here and religion is operating down here. Now, if we have this view, now you can see where non-overlapping magisteria comes in. What we've done is we've preserved religion. Right, in the view where we only have a universal science, religion is excluded. It has no space. Whereas now in this two levels view, and you can see from this, it's not a great step to say, oh, okay, I see where my two listism from the previous lectures comes in. With these two levels now, I've managed to preserve a niche for religion. And as long as they don't talk to, as long as religion doesn't try and talk about objective things, as long as religion doesn't try and demonstrate anything rationally, as long as it doesn't touch on facts but sticks to values, well, religion can do its thing. And as long as science doesn't try to get down into subjective things, and as long as science doesn't try to talk about particular things or things that depend on your religion or your opinion or your character, then science is up here. So we've protected religion from the rational, rigorous onslaught of science, and we've protected science from the subjective, irrational taint of religion. So this is non-overlapping magisteria, and it's not. When Stephen Jay Gould, he happened to not be religious, but he's not against religion. He's just saying, in order to protect religion from science and science from religion, we need to recognize they're doing different things, and that's okay. Now, even this provision is not without its problems, because we have in the middle truth. Now, what happens in our shadow layer with truth? Because if with our two layers we have universal science and particular religion, if we have objective science and subjective religion, well, if we have true science, religion is untrue. And there are some people who take this view and they say, yes, that's what it is. We have between the two layers, we have the opposites: universal, particular, fact, values, objective, subjective, true, false. And some religious people, some non-religious people, don't like that idea. They like to say, okay, we'd like religion to be true. Okay, so then we can say, okay, well, we've got objective truth here and subjective truth here, and we've got universal truth here, and we've got particular truth here. So some people would say, yes, these two layers, they're opposites on universality and objectivity and so on and so forth, but they both touch on truth. And then we say, well, is this truth that they touch on the same truth, or is it different truth? Is the truth also separated? Do you have a distinction between objective truth of science and subjective truth of religion? Or do they share this same truth? They somehow connect, they somehow touch at this one point of both seeking the same truth. So there are people who would say, okay, this split means that science is true and religion is not. There are some people who would say this split means there are two different kinds of truth. And some people would say this split means that the one point where science and religion can touch, where they do interact, is they're both at least pursuing and potentially finding truth. So I'm going to move on from that back to science, back to just science. So we've got this layer of maybe religious stuff where we can just tuck religion into this niche down here so that it doesn't disturb us from our science. We can do our science quite happy with. Don't worry about religious concerns. Okay, so back to science. Okay, so one of the great things about science is systematic, right? It doesn't cast around for truth, just hoping to find it. It doesn't sit on a rock waiting for the universe to reveal itself to me. It goes out and it looks for truth. It tracks down truth, and it doesn't do it in some random hoping kind of way. It has a systematic search for truth. And the great thing about science is we know what that systematic search for truth is. It is the scientific method, right? So we've got the scientific method here. We know what it is. We can write it down. And then we can say we know what science is because we just say, what are you doing? And are you doing what the scientific method says, right? Because if what you're doing follows the scientific method, then you're doing science. And if what you're doing doesn't follow the scientific method, then you're not doing science. And we've worked it out very nicely, and it's all very neat. And then it's then traceable, right? The traceability of science, indeed the demonstrability of science, is nothing more and nothing less than saying, can you show that you are following the scientific method? In fact, the demonstrability of the fact that what you are doing is science is nothing more and nothing less than being able to demonstrate that what you are doing is following the scientific method. And you can make a flowchart about it. It's simple. Anyone can understand it. We teach it to kids in primary school. And so we can take this vision and it is demonstrable. It is traceable. We can show our working. The scientific method is the guarantor of our science. And because everyone can see it, the scientific method is independent of your opinion. The scientific method doesn't care if you like it or you don't like it. It doesn't care if you want bigger government, or it doesn't care if you think that Muhammad was the final word in prophecy. It doesn't. It's the scientific method. You don't have Jewish methods and Confucian methods. Otherwise, it would be like scientific methods, or this is a scientific method. No, it's the scientific method, right? It's objective. It just, you write it down and everyone can look at it. You know what it is. You know what we're talking about, right? It's true for all people. It doesn't care about your religion or your background or what country you live in. We don't have the African scientific method. It's true in all places. It's true at all times, right? Someone who flies across the galaxy in a rocket to the far end of the reaches of where we can go, if they're following the scientific method when they get there, they're doing science. And if they're not following the scientific method, they're not doing science. It's really that simple. A peasant in the Indus Valley, even if they didn't know they were doing science, if they followed the scientific method, they were doing science. And if they weren't, they weren't. Right? The scientific method covers all questions. There's one of them, so it has to be coherent and consistent, right? You don't say, I'm going to use this scientific method for that question and this scientific method for that question. That would be crazy. Otherwise, we'd have scientific methods. And then you say, well, how am I going to pick which method I need to use? No, you say, I have the singular scientific method. It's systematic. It's universal. It applies to everything. It gives us the truth. And I'm going to breathe. So, this is what is at stake. When people hold on to science, when people get passionate about science, right, this is what they're passionate about. People set up this system in the first place because the entire continent they knew had been riven by war And they said there has to be a better way of finding the truth than killing each other, right? If science can give us the truth that all people can agree on, it gives us this fixed method that everyone can accept. War finishes, we have world peace. If you want to undermine science, you want to undermine world peace, presumably. And what kind of evil person would want to undermine world peace, right? Now, this is all interconnected, right? You can't pull out one bit without pulling out another. We had to be so radical as, you know, separate out these two layers if we wanted to have religion in. But what you can't do is you can't have religion enter into this objective layer. You can't have your scientific truth depending on your religious opinions, because if it does, then science isn't true for all people or in all places. It stops being universal. If it's not universal, it's not consistent. If it's not consistent, how can we call it the truth? And if we don't have some way of seeking and finding the truth with certainty, then we're back to war. So when someone says we cannot have religious perspectives taught in the classroom, we cannot have, you know, I have a science classroom and my science classroom is teaching evolution, and I will not let religion have a foot in the door, right? They're not being crazy, right? What they're looking at is they're looking at this picture here and they're saying, if religion enters the classroom, then we lose objectivity, then we lose universality, then we lose truth, then we lose science. And our modern world only exists because of science, right? The vaccines that we take, the aeroplanes that we fly or flew before the pandemic, right? The phones that we use, everything relies on science. It is underwritten by our scientific understanding and competence. And if you let religion into the classroom, it's the thin end of the wedge that will unravel all of this. There's no little bit where religion exists on the side without unraveling everything. If we give religion a toehold, we have lost everything. We have lost civilization as we know it. So when people say, I will take this to the Supreme Court, you say, why? Why is it so important to you? That person is not getting things out of proportion. If this view of science here is correct, if this view of science here is correct, then what they're doing is entirely reasonable, and we should all join them for the good of humanity. Now, the question, of course, that we're going to cover in the next couple of lectures is this view of science correct?